I'm Christopher Harris, and I'm joined here today by a bunch of established guests, esteemed guests. First we have is Kartik Krishnaiyer. Kartik, hello.
Great to be with you, Chris.
Great, excellent to have you. And then we also, in England, we have Lawrence Mckenna from the EPL Talk podcast. How are you doing, Lawrence?
I'm great, really good. I'm really just excited to be here.
Yeah, excellent. And last but not least, Richard Farley from NBCSports.com. Richard, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. I know Lawrence said he's excited to be here, but I actually mean it. I haven't talked to you guys enough for a long time, so it's really good to be back on the show.
That's a good point. That's good.
Well, so the way this show works, it's completely different than anything we've done before. So what we're going to do is each week we're going to look back at some of the major topics and discuss them in more detail, in more depth, rather than kind of skating over the issues and moving right along to the tons of stories. So we've picked out 3 this week that definitely are massive ones in terms of world soccer. First of all is transfer madness and player power. And just mentioned Suarez, Bale, and Rooney, and that sets off a whole argument right there. Second of all, we're going to talk about Bill Shankly and him versus the great Liverpool manager versus Bob Paisley, and also a great Liverpool manager in light of David Peace's brand new book that's just come out about Shankly. And then last but not least, in terms of the changing landscape of the soccer TV industry, there's been a lot of changes both in the United States with ESPN and Fox coming out with brand new shows, daily shows, as well as in the UK. We've got BT Sport. It's a new player coming up against Sky Sports, so some interesting developments there. But let's start off by talking about the transfer madness. And Richard, I want to ask you first in terms of the transfer window. Any thoughts on whether this should be abolished, perhaps?
Well, I've never gotten the transfer window, really. What it seems like is, it seems like nobody has ever really come to grips with how to manage player movement in a world where we're more globalized, traveling is easier, going between teams is more likely, particularly with more money coming into the football world. Well, what we have are these isolated windows that are relatively easy to manage, but it ends up developing to a very high-stakes game, of a high-stakes shell game. In my mind, I really don't know why people just can't switch employers at their or their employer's wills. And that's not to say that people should be able to jump immediately into competitions. I think each competition should have its own set of rules as to when players are eligible. But if somebody wanted to move to another team for pure lifestyle, employment, compensation purposes, 32 matches into the season, I don't know that there's a problem with that. I think we can separate that from whether they're eligible to compete for that team at that time.
Richard, what about contracts? So Suarez, Bale, Rooney, just 3 players in the news this summer. They have long-term contracts with the clubs, but so you're saying that they can kind of cut out of the contract early and go to other clubs? Or?
Yeah, I didn't really address that, and that's probably what more people are interested in. I think what people need to realize is that when players are signing on to these contracts, there really is kind of an implicit +1 agreement in a lot of places, where a player wants to sign. I mean, Robert Lewandowski for Bayern Munich is the best example of this, where it's been very clear that he and his representation kind of had a 3-year plan at Dortmund, and they're in their 4th year. Well, the whole reason he was signed for that 4th year was the understanding that they wanted to allow the club to have some leverage, so at the end of 3 years he would move on, and the club would be able to reap some reward, rather than just signing him to a 3-year deal and having him walk. And so that's the real controversy behind Dortmund. Now, you apply that to somebody like Gareth Bale, and we saw this also in the Luka Modric situation, where the player seemed to be claiming that promises had been made. And while maybe you shouldn't sign your name to that contract unless you really do intend to fulfill its term, the realities of the player versus club world just aren't exactly that clear. The politics, I should say, of that world.
Right. Now, Kartik, the history of this transfer window, I mean, way back when, there wasn't a transfer window. Clubs could come in, Manchester United, in March or April, towards the end of the season, and go ahead and buy a star striker, bring him in, and trying to finish the season off as champions. That's changed quite a bit in terms of what we have now with the summer transfer windows and kind of the winter transfer windows. In terms of the history, I mean, what's your thoughts on kind of the pros, cons of the current system versus the previous system where there were no windows?
I quite frankly don't see a pro of the current system except for player agents and for players to maybe manipulate and game the system. Although in reality, if a player like Luka Modric, as Richard mentions a few seasons ago at Spurs, are not able to get that move by the end of August, Daniel Levy was firm, then they're stuck. They're essentially held hostage for at least until January, perhaps for another year. It took another year for Modric to get that move. I mean, there's some historical transfers that happened in March. I mean, I think just of the club I support, Manchester City, bringing in Rodney Marsh in March of 1972, when we were 7 points ahead of Derby, Liverpool, and Leeds in the table. Marsh was considered perhaps the greatest player in English football at that point, and Manchester City lost the title because the chemistry didn't work. So it's not just an easy thing to say, oh, well, Manchester United, Chelsea, Manchester City, they'll buy up all the players in March and they'll coast to a title. There are chemistry issues. There are things that managers need to work out. I've never been a fan of the transfer window. I think the transfer window empowers agents. It's unfair on leagues like Major League Soccer in the United States, like the Brazilian League, like even the Russian League, which begins play in June, whose season is disrupted by these transfers. Major League Soccer and to a lesser extent North American Soccer League and USL Pro in North America, completely disrupted by the fact the transfer window coincides with the most important portion, arguably, of the seasons in those countries.
So how does getting rid of the transfer window change where the power dynamic is? This is what I'm struggling with.
Well, if you get rid of the transfer window, agents cannot hold clubs hostage and say, okay, my player is going to create this kind of trouble because he has to get a move by August 31st. The situation is
but he can just be like, well, okay, well, I'll just do it all season then.
Well, it eliminates that singular point of leverage. And so while somebody could say, I'm going to do that all season, the club can just say, well, you're telling me the situation is going to be the same tomorrow as it is today? Okay, we'll just deal with it, rather than having these two deadlines during the year.
People are still going to be able to force transfers, though. And people, so if a player, it doesn't change the Gareth Bale situation, doesn't change the Suarez situation.
And let me ask you this: why are transfers and emergency dispensation are allowed by the Premier League for goalkeepers? If a goalkeeper gets injured and you need a goalkeeper, the Premier League can allow you to reopen the transfer window just to sign a goalkeeper in March or April. Why isn't that afforded for any other position where you may have
the goalkeeper is a very specific set of skills, for instance. But I mean, it's hardly like someone, like Stuart Downing was excess to requirements last season at Liverpool. If all of their goalkeepers had been injured, I doubt they would have gone to him to go and goal. They would have needed someone who has a specific set of skills.
But fair enough. But doesn't this just inflate the value of players by having a transfer window with a very fine date of end, which is August 31st, where the last 2 weeks, this is probably good for the clubs also to get rid of the window, because agents can hold clubs hostages and say you have to pay 150 million pounds to get my client between now and August 31st. If you don't get him, then someone else is going to pay that price, or you're going to be so far back by January 1st when the transfer window reopens, you're going to it's blackmail.
Richard, this is interesting. Kartik and I are both we're coming at this from very different angles. Kartik has said a lot of things that are looking at it from the club's point of view, and I'm, in my mind, very much looking at it from the player's point of view, talking about being able to move and be employed by who you want and where you want, like a normal employee in another industry would be. But we're both coming to somewhat of the same conclusion. These isolated spans where a certain kind of activity can happen, and the rest of the year it can't happen at all. It just seems arbitrary, really. And I realize that there is a desire to have some continuity in these squads over long periods of time. But I think that's mostly because that's how most of the history of football has worked. But for most of the history of football, transfers were rare. Or at least they were so rare that from year to year you're going to have almost the same squad that you're following. And that's just a relic of a previous world. We need to have rules that reflect the current world.
Yeah, what about, actually, Carl, let me ask this question. I mean, in terms of for you, what about having the window be shorter and having it be aligned worldwide? So, for example, if it was July every year and January of every year, but a much shorter window rather than this kind of long, elongated window, would that improve things, Kartik?
No, shortening the window will make matters worse. It'll empower the agents even more to hold clubs hostage, to say, okay, you have till July 31st now, July 1 to July 31st, give my client this 4-year extension or he's going to hand in a transfer request. I think it would complicate matters. Look at the end of the January window in 2011 when Fernando Torres was sold to Chelsea for £50 million. There's a few hours left in the window. Liverpool turns around and overpays. Chelsea overpaid for Torres. Liverpool overpays for Carroll. Tottenham makes all kinds of having to keep up with these two moves, all kinds of crazy offers for the likes of Llorente and Kun Aguero and others. Doesn't land any of them, but it was just silly money going to agents being able to empower themselves through the media, through their chosen instruments in the press in the UK and other places to create this environment. I think it's horrible for football.
So what about Lawrence in terms of any ideas or any solutions of how to remedy this by kind of either stopping player power or agent power or being able to rein it in, perhaps? Any thoughts?
Well, it is about the dynamic, isn't it? I don't know how much we actually know about the player-club dynamic because so much of it is played out in the press where it's really more of a pantomime than it is truthful. And so, when people say, oh, he's unhappy, he's going to try and force a move or whatever, he's probably just said, it might be good to go somewhere else because I'm not happy here right now, but they make him sound furious and these kind of things. So I just wonder, first of all, I think, you can improve press relations from all the clubs. You can stop lying to them, first of all, like Brendan Rodgers does on a regular basis. The meeting went exceptionally well. He'll be here next season. He really wants to be here, and then he has to go out and do this in the press. I think one thing we might need to understand is that with this being such a high stakes, high money, whether it's an open window or whatever, people need to be held more accountable for a start because the press is the fourth estate. They're there to ask those questions. They're not there just to create entertainment. And the clubs need to understand that their relationship with everyone else. And I don't think the clubs often do that very well. But then I really appreciated what Levy's done and what John W. Henry's done at Liverpool in finalising the situation and not letting it run on. I think it's an interesting thing to do.
Which is interesting too, because at the same time, even though they've kind of finalised and said, okay, putting their feet in the sand, the newspapers are still looking for little scraps of detail or little gossips here and there to kind of keep it going.
But has it continued? And the question is, who does that matter to? Like, who's trying to engineer that? Is it the papers? There's so much that's not transparent, which is, I think, the transparency is also part of the problem.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with that, Lawrence.
Yeah, I think that's the issue with these two situations and Rooney also. It's not so much that, obviously the papers have an incentive to continue to churn up information that'll sell and get clicks, but there's a certain dissonance here. Like, it doesn't quite make sense why Tottenham is not selling Bale for a record transfer fee. It doesn't quite make sense why Liverpool is not letting Suarez go for the amount that Arsenal has reportedly said. It doesn't make sense that Manchester United wants to hold on to a player they don't really need anymore when they can get rid of him in his huge wages. So that's what's really, I think, churning this. Although papers do churn up rumors. They could churn up other rumors. They could be writing about David Luiz every day and his connection to Barcelona. With these three stories in particular...
Richard, couldn't they also be writing about actual stories? Like things that are happening in Newcastle and Sunderland and all these other places?
Actual stories in Newcastle, Sunderland? Good one.
No, but you know what I mean. Like, so, for instance, would you rather throw a dart at a dartboard and be like, right, so Suarez is going to Barcelona, or would you rather... have to actually do some research and find out what's going on. And then and people are like, oh, but that doesn't fit the market. You've got to sell something. People aren't interested in Newcastle. Well, if you don't give them the opportunity to be interested in Newcastle, then of course they're not going to be interested.
I think people do get the opportunities occasionally to be interested in these other stories. The simple fact is not. Well, but those occasions are very important because those are the way that editors test the waters on these kind of stories. They're not just going to keep giving you Villa stories for you not to click on them. The reason why these stories get published is because people click on them. It's not the other way around.
So you're saying it's decided by the market?
Basically. Editors are only responding to what people want. And I obviously speak from firsthand experience on that. I didn't put out these rumor mill galleries when I was previously employed places because I like them, I deplore them. but I also like keeping my job. And I also like giving people what they want. And if people are clicking on something just because I don't like it, who am I to sit there and kind of go, well, I'm going to pass ethical and moral judgment on this and say you don't get access to your rumors.
Well, it's nothing to do with them being yours or anyone else's rumors, but it does kind of take you back to the phrase of the BBC in a way. Like we almost need a BBC of sporting transfers, because the BBC certainly don't do their job in terms of that. That you could, and there was a director general when he first came to the BBC, and one of the first questions in a very formal, like black and white interview was, "Are you going to give the public what they want?" And his reply was, "Oh no, we'll give them something far better than that." And I just thought that answer sums it all up. Is that we get, as we have this experience. Maybe we're navel gazing a bit right now, but we have this experience that just because someone says they want it or they tweet you, therefore you should provide that. And I feel that that's part of the issue here. Maybe this is
journalists have a responsibility. I mean, that's
exactly.
The question. Journalists have a responsibility to diffuse this and to be more transparent about things. I mean, they're making up things, it seems, out of thin air in some publications, not all. Not all publications in Britain.
I think they have a responsibility to listen to more than one agent. That's for sure.
Right.
And I think the problem in England isn't so much that the information is made up. I don't think there's very much just made up information. I think the attempts to meet this outrageous demand lead people to only go with one source and then report it. And of course, that's ludicrous for reasons we alluded to earlier, because agents start manipulating the system. That kind of stuff is not journalistic standard in this country, because you just can't go based on what one person is saying. I mean, if you have an agent saying a club wants to pay this much money for my player, yeah, you can use that as a starting point. And even if the club doesn't confirm it, that doesn't necessarily mean the story's dead. But you need somebody with another perspective verifying that information. And that absolutely is not happening in most of the London/England based papers that we consume on a daily basis.
I would actually add too that I think the Guardian as a newspaper has gotten more into transfer stories in the past 12 months than they've ever done before. I think it was one of those things in the past. Especially the Mirror and the Sun, they'd kind of let them do their thing, the Daily Mail, Telegraph, etc. And the Guardian would step back and actually not report it until they had some factual information or they had a source. I think they're jumping in at the same time. So I think
they played a fairly interesting role in the Suarez. I thought the way they played Suarez was quite interesting, because they let him come to he came to them was the first thing, but they took the story like any good journalist would, and gave him a voice, which was great. And then the next day, I think it might have been Daniel Taylor or someone else, just wrote a scathing article about him.
Yes.
And I thought that
was the next day.
I thought that's exactly what a newspaper should be doing. Like they have no loyalty to Luis Suarez. Like, why would they have loyalty to someone who's just come to them and just given them a story? It's the same as Brexit. It's the same as anyone coming to you and giving you an interesting story. You don't have any loyalty to them. You can interpret that. And I still think that the Guardian's relationship with information is different to other newspapers, but they are more willing.
On Suarez specifically, how ironic is it that the same British press he's vilified, he's now using as an instrument to get what he wants? And in fairness to him, in absolute fairness to him, Liverpool have not taken the steps to reach the Champions League that maybe Suarez feels like they need to make for him to hang around there.
Ooh, that's probably a topic for another show. But I think Chris evoking the Guardian is a really good example, because we're talking about meeting a demand. Well, more rumor coverage is not the only way the Guardian has met demand. And they're putting animated GIFs on their site regularly. They're regularly incorporating YouTube content. This is not stuff that meets like our idea of journalism, but it does meet the idea of giving your audience what they want. And they see people linking to GIFs and rumors and YouTube videos in their comment section, and they ask themselves, why isn't that just part of the experience that we're giving people? And I think the other thing to remember here is we talk about journalistic standards and whether journalists should be pushing the conversation, and it's something I definitely agree with. But the reason we're all on the show right now is because we have a very high interest in those matters, whereas 96% of the market or so doesn't. They aren't so concerned about tuning into the Guardian or even tuning into the show and hearing this particular conversation. What they're concerned about is what happened to Suarez today.
Why though? So
because people have preferences.
What, their preference is for it to be lied to, or what?
No, well, okay, for you, me, Kartik, Chris, we spend so much time in the football world, but most people spend a couple hours a day, and in those couple hours a day, they don't get into meta discussions about stuff. They get into updating. They update themselves on their teams, the controversies around their teams, and the leagues that they're in, and then they're
wouldn't
gone.
you rather be well informed? I guess I'm asking a stupid question. Wouldn't you rather?
I don't think those people are ill-informed.
Well, I mean, but you're going to be ill-informed if your only source is the Sun.
Well, I think one thing though.
Let's not talk about that.
I think one thing though is who do you believe? I mean, do you believe the actual players who are being quoted in the press? Do you believe the manager? Do you believe the chairman? Do you believe the newspapers? And
don't believe anyone. Not until he's holding that shirt and he's like. But even then, he's like, I'm so happy to be here.
Right.
Whatever.
But the thing I've noticed is that unless there's something absolutely factual, the Independent or the Telegraph, and they come from two very different political perspectives, so it's not a political or ideological discussion. They don't publish things now that the Guardian has begun publishing in the last year. That to me is pretty telling of where the Guardian thinks the audience is. And the Guardian, I think, has their finger on the pulse more than the Independent or the Telegraph.
Kartik, also bear in mind how they frame. I think that's an important thing. How they frame these rumors. So when they're writing them up, they're not being gospel.
They mock some of them, right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and they'll mock a lot of them. And credit to people like Football 365 as well. This is very navel-gazing, but credit to people like Football 365 who go through the articles and just show the hypocrisy, because there needs to be more stuff like that. There needs to be more people showing the hypocrisy of the press, because
and James Richardson does that to a certain extent with his European paper roundup, picking up Marca and saying, this is laughable.
Well done
what
to
are they
him.
Talking about?
They're all doing such a good job.
And this probably hits at a core that there are good rumors and there are bad rumors, and the good rumors are the ones that actually have some grounding, have some quotes, make sense, actually get at the truth of the situation. And then there are bad rumors, which are really just out there to get a headline. And so that's where the criticism that Lawrence just alluded to really, really is helpful, because if we only had a world of good rumors, well, that would be a very exciting world, because that gives us more information. But now we're in a world that is, we're looking, we're looking for a picture we threw away and it's in the garbage that's already full, basically. And we're looking for that one little momentum.
Don't take away from my happy little utopia that we're building. It could happen. It just won't.
So, Kartik, any solution for this madness in terms of just the whole transfer kind of topic in general? Because it is one of those. It's been a silly season times 10 this summer. It's still not even over yet. But any solutions on how to remedy this?
Abolish the transfer window. I say summer window is gone. You allow transfers until set by each league individually. Let's say for Italy, Spain, Germany, France, England, you set a transfer deadline on March 31st, and then the transfer window reopens June 1st. It goes June 1st to March 31st.
Why not just go all year round? Just go all year round and just
because you do want to have a deadline where a team cannot sign a player before a potential title winning
game. Why not? You know what? Why not just go 365? You can Christmas Day. Someone could be signing.
This is more of a happy medium, and obviously for Champions League, you have to name your squads in advance of each round. So
we'll change that. We'll just change it.
But Richard, what about Major League Soccer? If you do a March 31st to kind of June 1st transfer window, how does that impact Major League Soccer and other leagues around the world that are playing during that period of the summer?
Well, for Major League Soccer, it would become more like a conventional American sports league where you have free transactions through a certain percentage of the season, and then your roster is essentially frozen. Here in the United States, we call those trade deadlines. So that would actually be something that would make a little bit more sense to the mainstream sports fan in this country. As far as the rest of the world is concerned, it is kind of interesting, and I agree with Kartik that Major League Soccer has a growing problem getting on the same schedule as the rest of the world, because with the money that's in Major League Soccer now, they're more and more going to be trading players with Europe. But on the other hand, Major League Soccer now has more money than most leagues in the world, so they can kind of, in a way, dictate the terms that agents are starting to organize their contracts around. So it is the proverbial double-edged sword.
Interesting. Okay, well, let's move on to the next topic of our discussion on This Week is Soccer, and that is Shankly versus Paisley. So both of them are very historic Liverpool managers who achieved great success at Liverpool. back in the 70s and 80s. And Kartik, I want to start off with you in terms of David Peace's new book, about Bill Shankly, which is called Red or Dead, just came out this past week. And in it, he writes about Bill Shankly, of course, and kind of the man and the mystery. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I do plan on doing so in the future. But why does Shankly get more credit than Bob Paisley, in your estimation?
I think it's a cultural thing in Liverpool. Let me first say I look forward to reading Mr. Peace's book. I read his previous work on Brian Clough, and that was more of a eloquent takedown of Brian Clough. Maybe helped to elevate Clough in the minds of some of those of us who were younger, but at the same time was a takedown. This appears to be more of a eulogy of Bill Shankly. I think Shankly, he built the institution of Liverpool Football Club that maintained itself through Paisley's reign, through Joe Fagan, through Kenny Dalglish, and on into the current era.
No, just Kenny Dalglish. It stopped at Kenny Dalglish. Let's all just acknowledge.
Right, because we don't want to give Graham Souness any credit. Graham Souness did what he was almost the reverse engineer of Bill Shankly, I guess, if you look at it from the perspective of supporters. But I think it has so much to do with the institution he built and the culture around the club that developed. Now, as far as on-the-pitch achievements, Bob Paisley is second to none in the history of British football, with the exception of Sir Matt Busby and Sir Alex Ferguson. Bob Paisley is the most successful English manager of all time at the club level. Obviously, he's up there with the Sir Alf Ramseys and Sir Bobby Robsons as far as being a great English manager, post-war English manager. However, Paisley doesn't get his due, and I think a lot of that has to do with the culture that Shankly built and a fallacy that has developed that Paisley simply took what Shankly had built and kept it on autopilot, which in fact that was not the case. Paisley created a side in his own mold and his own identity within his second or third season at Liverpool, which is a challenge which David Moyes now faces at Manchester United.
Can I cut in here, Chris?
Sure, absolutely.
I mean, I suppose people are sick of hearing about the Liverpool documentary I made for TalkSport, but it was quite a discovery. There was a lot of interesting stuff in there, and we spoke to a lot of people about Shankly, and so I guess that I can kind of span this over the conversation. But there were big milestones that Shankly set in the history of the club, and Kartik's alluded to them. But the first was that Liverpool were in Division 2 when he got to the club. They weren't a first division side, and they hadn't been for a few years, and they weren't looking to be because they had no idea what was going on. He faced up to the board and told them that he wanted the transfers and he wanted to handle those things. That's a huge thing. He then built his own backroom staff, which was pretty innovative at the time. The boot room was a pretty innovative idea at the time, especially considering that you don't build anything generally by committee, or at least if you do, it tends not to work. And then he implemented a certain style of football. He brought in certain people who fitted. Scottish people tend to repeat themselves a lot within Liverpool history. But he brought Scottish people back and made them more. He brought in Ron Yates, and he brought in Ian St. John, and those guys were huge in it. And then the final thing was, and this was a story told to me, so it's just coming out of my mouth. It's not my own story. It's the Beatle mayor, basically, his name escapes me now, but he brought the Beatles back to Liverpool, and they came off the bus to this huge, rapturous applause. People from all over Liverpool had gathered. 2 weeks later, Liverpool won the FA Cup in 1965, and 1 million people turned out. More people turned up for Liverpool than turned up for the Beatles, and that just spoke volumes about what the FA Cup meant to Liverpool. And when I was speaking to Ian St. John, he spoke about the importance of what winning that initial FA Cup meant to Liverpool, because it was just so significant. They'd broken so many of the hoodoo things that had built up, and it was that combined with I'll stop talking in a second. It was that combined with everything he did off the pitch, and Bob Paisley didn't do that off the pitch. But it would be unfair to say that Bob Paisley didn't very much help Shankly on the pitch, because as far as I can garner, Shankly wasn't the tactician that he needed to be. It was Paisley and the other people who attacked, and basically Shankly would motivate the players.
Mm-hmm. Which is an interesting kind of transition in terms of Liverpool, in terms of from those 70s, from Shankly onwards, in terms of to Paisley and through to Dalglish and etc. throughout the Joe Fagan and other managers. It worked very, very well. But Richard, I was going to ask you too, from an American perspective, from somebody from across the pond, in terms of the Liverpool kind of history and the folklore and the stories about these types of managers, in terms of kind of your thoughts, in terms of what you saw in just doing your research and kind of watching football over these years, where Paisley kind of fit into that kind of timeline.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think as Americans we don't admit enough that we are detached from this in a way that a lot of people will ignorantly use to undercut our fandom or our knowledge. But particularly the way that soccer has grown here in the United States, the arc of it, makes sense that you feel a bit detached from Shankly and Paisley and don't quite understand the connection that people who have been lifelong Liverpool fans, who have lived in Liverpool, who have grown up around the club, that they have. So I of course look at this a little bit in a more detached and, I mean, frankly, more objective way. And the one thing that dawns on me in thinking about Shankly and Paisley is the idea of how people form people's psychology and how they form identity. Paisley had an identity with Liverpool before he became manager. He was obviously a long-time player, assistant under Shankly. I think that he even was a physio for a while there after his playing days. But he was known as a player before he was known as a manager. And for humans, it's very difficult for humans. For people, it's very difficult to shift identities of people. And that's why people rarely talk about Alex Ferguson's great playing days, because he's a manager to us. He's not a player. Well, Paisley is never going to be the same manager that Shankly was, because while a lot of his history is written by the fanatical Liverpool supporters who are always going to be the ones that cultivate a club's history, that means Shankly is the manager, and Paisley, he was always a player who then became a manager. So I think that might be some of the dissonance here, is that Paisley had an identity before he was collecting silverware.
To be fair, though, in the modern age, most people don't know that Paisley even played.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Like, most people will see him as a manager. But I guess that helped at the time. But
that's a great point.
But you're either a great manager or a great player. I've noticed
this. He wasn't a great player.
Well, no, because I mean, I take my perspective with Manchester City, for example. Sir Matt Busby was a very good player for Manchester City. Don Revie was an outstanding player for Manchester City. Their playing accomplishments are forgotten. Maybe Busby by design, because he went to manage Manchester United. Revie's playing accomplishments with Manchester City forgotten in order to develop this narrative of him as this great Leeds United manager, and then obviously failure with England. But I've noticed when you have a manager you're trying to elevate to great manager status, there's oftentimes and even with Clough, his playing career was successful. It was cut short by an injury. With Brian Clough, there was very little focus on his playing career because he was a great manager.
Great English striker.
Can I also say,
we all remember that from the film.
But there's commonality out of all these things. I mean, I've got a book. I think it's written by Ollie Holt, but don't hold that against it. It was about it was basically about the parallels between Shankly and Ferguson, and how Ferguson hilariously used to play Shankly giving speeches on the bus, and Gordon Strachan's ultimate undermining of Ferguson was when he stole that tape and threw it off the bus. Just is an interesting side story, but
that's funny.
I mean, they talk about the social influence as well, and I think there's with all these managers, there's a huge social influence, and it's about this. What was so prevalent in the 60s and the 70s was about the breaking down of so many different social orders and those sorts of things. And Shankly did that. Clough did that. All these guys were people who worked their way up in the public guys, from being someone who couldn't wear a suit and would probably work in a mine, to someone who was wearing a suit on television, and what they were saying was the height of the importance for that city. And there's a huge significance to that, and because of that, it gave Liverpool a huge identity. It gave them a link to other places in the world, whereas before they felt very isolated as a place because of politics, etc. And to some extent, that still hinders the club, because people are unsure of what that is now. It's become diluted over time. And that's possibly why Shankly is so important, is because he represents so much of what was important in Liverpool's history, and yet there are so few people who are informed about him now. And so, when you contrast the two, it makes him so much more important, and yet there are so many people who are willing to talk about him but don't know.
When Paisley passed away, I think that was the kind of proper discussion of Liverpool and the mines and the working class and everything that the city had gone through in the 1960s and 1970s and into the 1980s. I heard intellectual discussions about the points you just made, Lawrence, so vividly in 1997, I believe it was, when Paisley passed away, which I had not heard since and would like to hear since, and perhaps in both Shankly and Paisley's case, we need to talk about them in a greater sense, because they had such a cultural influence on a city that was very much isolated and was very much...
It's hard to do that now, though, Kartik, because the Liverpool way and what they represent has become watered down to some extent, or has become somewhat of a stick to beat the club with, or to beat the fans with.
Or to beat the city with.
An interesting point...
fans with it too, not just Liverpool fans.
I mean,
side with it.
Yeah, exactly, and I think it's an unhealthy relationship. We shouldn't be lamenting Liverpool too much, because actually it's not all that terrible a situation. But I spoke to Neil Atkinson from the Anfield Rap, and he said it's never framed in a positive light, and it's about the positivity with which you surround it and where that conversation takes you. And so often these conversations about Shankly and Paisley and all these historical figures get weighed down by the negativity, which ultimately surrounds quite a positive story.
Lawrence, I'm sorry, go ahead, Richard.
Well, I mean, I don't know if this was true or implying, Lawrence, but using the term the Liverpool way as either a crutch or a weapon in this conversation, just saying something like the club name way is just such an arrogant way of saying anything, really. I mean,
well, yeah, exactly, and that's why it kind of stinks of hypocrisy. It stinks of all the things that you wouldn't want to hear in a conversation, and it's also it can be quite. It also puts them it puts anyone who says it in a position of power, because the assumption and the implication would be, oh well, I know what the Liverpool way is, and I need to tell you about this, and it's important to both of us because. Well, I'm a Liverpool fan and you're a Liverpool fan, or I'm a Liverpool fan and you're a Manchester United fan, and you need to understand what the Liverpool way is. And so there's an implication of a power dynamic there. And again, I imagine at that point you probably need to say Shankly wouldn't have been happy with that, and just end the conversation there.
Yeah.
And to what extent has that now hindered the club? That there's
hugely, Kartik. It's a thorn in the side of Liverpool so often. Yeah.
I think in many ways, though, too, I mean, when you say the Liverpool way, as long as it's working, it's okay. It's the same thing as Barcelona. When you're winning, you say the Barcelona way, fantastic. But when you start to lose key matches and it starts to kind of, perhaps you've passed that zenith and you're on the downward spiral, then it can be kind of problematic. But Lawrence, I wanted to finish off with you in terms of, you've been to Anfield many, many times to watch matches there. What's the difference in presence in terms of the spirit of Shankly versus the spirit of Paisley at Anfield, whether that comes through from banners, flags, songs, chants? I mean, is there much of Paisley at Anfield at a typical Liverpool match?
I think the two go hand in hand. I mean, there are faces on all those huge flags. Rafa is one. I think we could probably talk about Rafa as well as in this violent of managers for Liverpool.
Right.
But in a slightly different way. But there's still a Paisley flag, there's still a Shankly flag. It's just I think that also it just so happens that Shankly gave those fans a voice, and he gave them so much more than just great. It wasn't great football. It was actually not great football at all. But he gave them something off the pitch as well. And the Anfield found its voice at that time. It found itself being the Cop, and that was suddenly famous. And it found itself being a stadium that became a difficult place to go to. And Shankly built that, and that's important to recognise that as well, is that when people are in that geographic location, it makes a huge difference to what they're thinking. But you see his legacy around you, whereas you don't see so much of Paisley's legacy. That sign that they touched before they got on the pitch was Shankly's idea. This is Anfield, was Shankly's idea, because some Newcastle player said, "Where are we again?" And Shankly literally went and got a hammer and just bashed it up against the wall and was like, "Oh, here you are." And so all these kind of mystical things are quite interesting. But it's about I think the two go hand in hand. People don't see in Anfield. People don't see Shankly and Paisley. They see the boot room. That's what they see.
Exactly. Great. Well, let's move on to our third and final topic of This Week in Soccer. And this one's going to be an interesting one, myself included especially, is going to be the topic of the media shakeup, both stateside and in the UK, with different players involved, different types of shows involved. In the United States, we've got NBC Sports getting ready to launch their Premier League coverage beginning Saturday, August 17th for the next 3 years. In the UK, we have BT Sport that's coming on board. That's replacing ESPN UK, and they're going to be alongside Sky Sports. Lawrence, let me start off with you in terms of BT Sport. Of course, the season hasn't started yet, but what have you seen thus far in terms of talent, advertising, kind of promotion, all of that things, but also in terms of quality of what you've seen on television thus far in terms of their coverage coming up to the Premier League?
You'll be pleased to know that they continued with the cloud theme, which most people, the misty sort of smoky cloud theme in their advertising. Nike took that and they had both Manchester United and Man City in a smoky cloud theme. BT did not shy away from that. They've used smoke and mirrors, I'd imagine, quite a lot. So the advertising's been great. There's been a lot of skepticism. I went to a talk about the future of football, and there was someone there from BT Sport. And I have great faith in a lot of people, but I always question when people come out with the kind of, we're going to be innovative. And I don't like to criticize other pundits, but we're going to be innovative. But we'll bring on Tim Lovejoy, and we'll bring on Rio Ferdinand, and we'll bring on Michael Owen, and we'll bring out the same faces when there are plenty of people who could be talking from other angles. We'll bring. How can you claim to be different when what you're showing is very similar and the same thing? Mm-hmm. And I imagine what it is this is a thing that they need to do over time. But Setanta Sports said that, ESPN have said that. And I think a lot of people are sick of hearing it because they don't feel like they're getting what they want, which ultimately is to watch some football. People just want to see football. And the good thing, the most innovative thing BT Sport have done, made it free for their broadband customers. But again, it's not on terrestrial television. There's still hoops you have to jump through.
It's interesting too because I think BT Sport just passed their 1 million customers, so 1 million customers in the UK. The one thing I have noticed that it has done so far is actually it's upped Sky Sports' game. So Sky Sports did, I think about a week ago, they did kind of a live around all 92 football grounds in the
As enjoyable as that was, yes. And that was just brilliant that they could patronise. They found something that they could patronise people with yet again, because they didn't have the FA Cup on at that time. I mean, Kartik, you've got quite a different view from me, obviously. Obviously, it's not the BT thing that you're interested in. There's a couple of other things you're interested in, but the football in the States harshly contrasts the football in the UK.
Yeah, and I certainly think as far as BT is concerned, they have the market ability that ESPN and Setanta didn't have to bring about this change in the UK, to challenge Sky in some respects. Yeah. Not saying they will, because a lot of what they've said is very cliche-ish, very similar to the commentary we've heard from these other networks in the past, obviously. So from Setanta and ESPN in particular. But here in the States, we've got a situation where the two networks that just lost Premier League rights, ESPN and Fox, are launching almost simultaneously, a week apart, launching daily soccer wrap-up shows to discuss the world of football. ESPN's debuted on Sunday, ESPN FC. Fox's will debut next week. And I find it very interesting because this comes right after they've lost the Premier League rights. At the time when they had the rights to the Premier League, they didn't seem as interested in pushing a daily product talking about the sport. Now that they've lost the Premier League rights, in the case of ESPN, they had the La Liga rights for a few seasons, or a portion of the La Liga rights, and lost them. This would have been very good television to have in 2011, when they had La Liga and Premier League rights, and they had Manchester United and Barcelona arguably as the two best teams in the world. But now they've decided to launch this program, which is almost an Americanized version of Press Pass, which we see around the world, at this stage. I've watched the program both nights it's been on. here in the States and have taken some keen interest in the program. There are things I like about the program a great deal. I like the pundits on there. Dan Thomas is to me, one of the best presenters in the business. I'm glad that they're featuring him on American television now. But I'm not sure that necessarily the format or the interest is there with no context. The context is lost since they no longer have the rights to those leagues.
Richard, I was going to ask you, in terms of how ESPN is positioning or targeting this show, even whether it's at kind of mainstream sports fans, diehard soccer fans, or kind of somewhere in between, and how they're doing in terms of trying to keep both sides of the fence satisfied.
Yeah, I think that's the most excuse me. That's the most interesting part to me, because I think ESPN, their general their MO is to make credibility plays in wherever they're entering. I mean, unless they're talking about Tim Tebow, of course. But I think that
Aaron Hernandez.
Yeah, I think they're really trying to be put on a credible show, and there's obviously nothing wrong with that. And you don't ever want to do anything that is not credible. But I still think that from what I've seen of ESPN FC, it's a little bit inaccessible for where it's being positioned actually on the channel. It's a bit ironic, because the big complaint about Fox is that they dumb it down too much, and I completely agree that they dumb it down way too much, and it's beyond patronizing. It's insulting at times. But there is a little bit of that spirit that ESPN can take and not immediately kind of throw people into the deep end. Again, this goes back to the same thing we were talking about with the Guardians coverage. There's 4% of us that just consume so much of the stuff that we don't want to hear about the minor details. ESPN, where they're positioning ESPN FC, is a place where they need to draw in more mainstream fans. I'm not talking about minor details like explain the offside rule. I'm talking about minor details about explaining why Manchester United don't necessarily need Wayne Rooney anymore. And it's a conversation that we've been having all summer, but the person that is tuning in from an NFL football game that knows a little bit about the Premier League would like to hear a debate about how useful Wayne Rooney really is at Manchester United anymore. So rather than kind of immediately jumping into the deep end with a lot of details and a little bit too much inside baseball information, I would like them to have a little bit, I know this is going to make people cringe, have a little bit more conversation that's kind of like the conversation we hear from Alexi Lawless, basically, where he's kind of engaging, intelligent conversation, but on a mainstream sports level. And I think that's what ESPN FC is missing a little bit.
But Kartik, I'm wondering in terms of kind of catering to the mainstream audience and try and bring them in and giving them more of a kind of Alexi Lawless angle in terms of the way he kind of communicates. At the same time, what's that going to do to the hardcore soccer fans in terms of getting them to watch the show?
Well, Lawless specifically can cater to both audiences. He's quite talented at that. He can be a football snob like we are at times when he needs to be. So I think that's one thing. I think Richard's point is well taken, though. The accessibility of the show. I tuned in yesterday right away. They're having an interview with Clint Dempsey. They're having a roundtable discussion about Manchester United, where they sit relative to their result in the Charity Shield. As I said, there's little context, and I think part of the reason there's little context is ESPN no longer has the rights to the leagues that they're discussing. Now, they have the rights to Major League Soccer, of course, but when we talk about the fact that they had Bundesliga rights on ESPN3 at one point, they don't have that anymore. They had Premier League rights on ESPN3 and on ESPN2. They don't have that anymore. They had Deportes and ESPN2 rights for La Liga. They don't have that anymore. So it's almost like they've launched a show at the tail end of their era, their window of opportunity, as the soccer audience in this country, at least the educated soccer audience, not that mainstream sports fan Richard's talking about, but the tuned-in soccer audience is gravitating towards NBC. Right. And I think that that's also part of the reason Fox has launched this show. Fox obviously still has the Champions League, which they will show midweek on Fox Sports 1. However, the approaches between Fox and ESPN, very interesting. I think we have not seen the Fox show yet, I should add, but as Richard implies, they every indication is that it's going to be a dumbed-down show, and probably for someone like me, or like the four of us, the level of analysis on that show is not going to match ESPN FC. I will watch ESPN FC every day, even though I'm giving some mild criticisms of the show. I'm going to watch the show every day. I cannot guarantee I would watch the Fox show every day just based on their choice of host and where I think the show is probably going to go.
Yeah, I think both shows are not doing, from what I've seen, from what I've heard about Fox's show, will be consistent with everything that they've done with their soccer properties over the years, and what we've seen from ESPN FC, and consistent with the kind of coverage that they provide. Both shows, I think, or both companies miss what the mainstream or the target demographic is. I think ESPN is not providing enough accessibility. They don't have to dumb it down, but they definitely are, I think. They seem scared of people saying that they are dumbing it down. Whereas Fox, I think, just has a low opinion of what people know about soccer, basically. Getting to the point where they have Michael Strahan explaining the rules before a Champions League final. I think Fox has a very low opinion of readers and viewers, and I think that ESPN maybe overestimates or underestimates what it takes to draw in the mainstream person. And I think, as Kartik said, and I think, Chris, you alluded to this too, there is a way to do that while still being intelligent. There's a way to address conversation topics that people like the four of us have heard over and over again, but do it in a way that brings in the mainstream person and sustains our attention.
But there's, I think, some experience that ESPN went through during the 2006 World Cup in particular, when they brought Dave O'Brien into the booth. They tried to dumb down everything to explain to the mainstream audience. And guys like Lawless were overstating the case for the United States in that particular tournament. Guys like Lawless were saying, hey, the United States could win the World Cup, which was absolute bollocks. I mean, there was no way that was even in consideration, considering the group the U.S. was drawn into also. I think based on that experience, John Skipper took that. He's a guy who knows a lot about this sport, unlike some of his counterparts at ESPN, and said, okay, we know what our audience is. It is a niche, okay? It's not going to be the NFL. It's not the NBA, but there's a niche audience, and it's a bigger niche than many of my colleagues at ESPN thought it was previously. We're going to cater to that niche, and we're catering to that niche, and we're going to cater to it successfully, and so far so good with that. This show may be even a little dumbed down, honestly, from where Press Pass was, which was a show I loved and I watched religiously.
Lawrence,
I agree.
Lawrence, I want to get your perspective on this too. I mean, coming from the UK, living there, of course, being used to 24/7 Sky Sports News, 24/7 Talk Sport, and all the different types of media. And then we have here in the United States with a brand new show that launched on ESPN this week, Fox next week, basically a 30-minute show that's going to be a kind of a daily show. What's your thoughts on that in terms of, is that something that you could see working perhaps in the UK, or is it completely a different market?
Well, I agree it's a different market, but then it's a pretty untested market because, Sky have pretty much strangled out whatever competition there was because the structure of the Premier League. I'm not saying that's necessarily the worst thing. I'm just saying, it does strangle competition because of their dominance, and it's a duopoly. It's a monopoly. And I guess, you can talk about 24/7 Sky Sports, you can talk about 24/7 Talk Sport, those sort of things. But it's not 24/7 if you're just running the same stories over and over. That's 1 hour on a loop, okay, over and over again. And that's for us with slight changes in the script, and I guess that's part of the issue here is that it's not necessarily, we're not necessarily getting what is billed, and I imagine a lot of people are talking about filling time. I imagine a lot of people are talking about filling those out because they don't have, they need to put their resources into something else. And I think Richard and Kartik both made a great point that, you don't have to isolate people just because you want to have some rich analysis. You many times on the site have posted Gary Neville's analysis, and there's never been, and commenters are generally considered to be stupid people, right? But they're not. And there have been a number of people commenting below saying...
He might be the exception to that, Lawrence. But
well, no, that's not true. There's a number of people who, have commented below like, oh, this is great. I've not seen this anywhere else. Why can't I get this anywhere else? Well, that's because you've got Robbie Savage on 5 Live.
Right.
That's because you've got Robbie Savage sitting there telling you, that the MLS is a rubbish league because he could play in it. and those kind of things. Those kind of comments are the sort of thing that it's the anti-intellectualism that is paired with a lot of television culture, which I think does it damage.
I think it's great that you bring up.
Oh, I was going to say, isn't the anti-intellectualism particularly strong in Britain as far as this game is concerned?
Well, yeah, but I think it penetrates into the States a little bit. Even basically, it's bad in England because you pair up anti-intellectualism with people in the TV industry being like, we have to cater to idiots. So these people are stupid. They don't know anything. We have to make them more. Whereas in the States, it's just that in the States they're just like, listen, we have to cater to idiots.
Well, I think with
it's not true.
But I think with that too, that's News Corp, and News Corp is owners of the Sun, owners of Sky Sports, exactly, and owners of Fox. So there's a commonality there in terms of kind of appealing to the masses, kind of dumbing it down, and it sells.
But the masses aren't. Yeah, but so what? So what? I know it sells, and that keeps the market going. But you'd argue that that doesn't mean that other things won't sell as well. People's conclusion tends to be, look, this is selling, and they almost have like this bipolar attitude to it, that if this is selling, then nothing else will.
Yeah,
because
that
this
again
is what people want.
That again gets back into this world where all of us people that spend so much time on these blogs and doing podcasts, we have this conversation, we just like, wow, this is so great. If people just put this on the air, yeah, really not so actually, because there's a reason why like some of these mainstream people that don't write the same way or present the same way that we do on blogs don't get so into so many details that we love, why they're more successful than some of the blogs out there. But I think one great example that you brought up, Lawrence, that is really just like the example of being accessible to mainstream while being intelligent to the people who follow things every day is Gary Neville. And Gary Neville obviously speaks in great detail, great analysis, and on one hand you would think that that wouldn't appeal to somebody who's coming from a baseball or a football or an American football game. I don't think that's true. I think when he's breaking down the tactics of a match or how a play developed or why a certain call was crucial or decision was crucial, he's actually breaking it down in a very simple, detailed way that anybody who has a passing interest in the sport would understand. And I don't think producers and executives see it like that. I think they see Gary Neville's analysis on Monday Night Football as being above the conversation, when really it just gets to the same level of detail that we can all share in. Everybody knows when can look at a right back turning his hips the wrong way and a left winger going around him. Anybody who watches any sport can understand that. And that's the kind of stuff that Gary Neville points out. Somebody stepped the wrong way. They pushed at the wrong time. You don't need to be a soccer expert to see that's going to be a problem for that team. And so why don't we have a Gary Neville-like segment every night on ESPN FC? Coincidentally, this is what Warren Barton and Bobby McMahon used to do at halftime of Champions League matches on Fox. Of course, Fox went away from that 3 years ago.
Right.
Yeah,
absolutely. And actually, Bobby and Warren did a good job. But I think they weren't able to kind of actually communicate it as well as Gary did in terms of whether it was the technology on screen but they tried. They tried to make it work. Kartik, I'm wondering in terms of these shows, these daily shows specifically, there's so much information on the internet. I mean, all of us live on the internet in terms of our soccer knowledge, as well as watching television, of course. But in a day where we might be watching, soccer goal highlights, basically within seconds or within minutes of actually goals being scored, with deep analysis. I mean, with all sorts of coverage. By the end of the day, United States, U.S. time, I think 4:30 for Fox and basically 5:30 for ESPN. What's the validity of those types of shows if most hardcore soccer fans are probably up to speed on all the news? How can they differentiate and make those shows worthwhile for hardcore soccer fans to watch?
If the expert opinions, Chris, are good, if they're incisive, if they're different than what you're reading, if they're given by people who are experts in their field, then someone like me would tune in. That's why I can say I know Gab Marcotti is going to be on ESPN FC every now and then. I know Craig Burley is going to be on regularly. I know that Raphael Honigstein, Sid Lowe, I know they're going to come on. So that appeals to me as a hardcore football / soccer fan. Now, if I'm just going to see highlights that I've already seen before, this is what Fox did years ago. This is what Fox did with this Match Day 2 program they had on after the Premier League games these last few seasons, with dumbed down expert analysis. if you could even call it expert analysis. If you let Warren Barton and Eric Winalda go, it would be good, but they didn't let them go. It was very dumbed down. They just showed match highlights that we'd already seen, and it wasn't worth the extra hour of my time to watch that program, and I rarely, if ever, watch that program. However, ESPN FC, as I said, they've got people who, as a football fan, as a soccer fan, appeal to me. And I just rattle off the list: Farley, Marcotti, Honigstein, on and on and on. The Fox program is not going to have that, unfortunately. So, from my perspective, ESPN FC is more watchable. But again, that's my personal preference. That's not saying that the marketplace is going to dictate that ESPN is more successful than Fox. The marketplace may dictate the exact opposite of that.
I just want to finish up this conversation in terms of talking about NBC Sports, again, with the Premier League coverage. But in terms of all the matches they're going to be showing, so all the matches are going to be available live on television and internet, depending on what type of TV provider you have. But I'm wondering if there's, and then there's also the additional programming, not only kind of the pre-match, halftime, and post-match programming, but lots of shows, match of the day, kind of the NBC version, and many, many more. I'm wondering if there's enough demand to meet the needs of all this programming.
Yeah.
Kartik, do you want to kick off that one?
Yeah, I'm a little bit concerned about it, quite honestly. I mean, we all live in this fantasy world. I think Richard and I in particular have talked about this through the years, where the sport would be covered the way other sports are covered in this country. But when I sat on the conference calls the last couple of weeks with NBC Sports executives and have been reading the details of their coverage plans, it excites me. It really excites me and tells me, okay, we've arrived. This is where we've wanted to be for years. But then it scares me on another front, because I think, well, is there really demand for a match of the day type program, a Saturday and Sunday in the United States? Is there demand for an entire program dedicated to Manchester United and Manchester City, which basically we're going to see on a Monday night? Is there demand for an entire program dedicated to Arsenal, Chelsea, Tottenham? I think Liverpool might be part of that too, that we're going to see on a Tuesday night. Is there going to be oversaturation of this sport in the market, especially given these ESPN and Fox programs, which, as I said, don't have the context anymore of matches as lead-ins, or those networks having the rights to broadcast games that they're discussing live. But is there all of a sudden we've gone from famine to feast? We have an oversaturation of content in this country. I am concerned about it, and I certainly hope NBC has marketing plans to keep this sustainable. I know they're coming out with a big bang. A lot of people excited. There are a lot of people who I speak to who are football fans, Latino football fans here in the United States, who don't normally watch the European leagues. They watch the Brazilian league, they watch the Argentine league, what have you, who are excited about the Premier League for the first time, because they're saying, oh my gosh, NBC's going all out. Now I can respectably be a football fan. I don't have to hide my fandom and watch on Gold TV and pretend like I'm an American football fan in public, and I can reconnect with the passion of my sport. But I don't know how sustainable that is. I hope it's sustainable. We certainly all hope it's sustainable, but do those people then lose interest after a couple of weeks? Do we have the casual sports fan attracted to NBC because of their clever advertising and the immense amount of money and effort they put into promotion? After a couple of weeks, say, okay, this is a season that lasts from August to May. We're accustomed to American sports that don't have to keep our attention for very long because the seasons are short. I think of college basketball and college football in particular. College football, you kick off September, and by December 5th, you've determined all the conference champions. I mean, that's kind of the format of American sports. So that's a challenge for NBC, and let's hope that they haven't oversaturated with programming. But it's exciting for those junkies like us.
Absolutely, most definitely. Richard, I want to kind of end the show, the first episode, but just giving you guys an opportunity to give yourselves a plug in terms of where we can find your work. What are some of the things you've been working on recently that are exciting or interesting that we should know about?
Well, I'm really excited about this new project I'm involved with. It's called Week in Soccer, and it's going to be a weekly show on WorldSoccerTalk.com. There are a couple of other things that I'm involved with. I work regularly for NBC Sports and their Pro Soccer Talk blog, so you'll find my work there. I'm writing about both European football and MLS football there, and then now regularly featured at The Guardian writing about MLS football, and then a couple of other sites where I'll write about women's soccer a lot, which is another, as people probably know, huge passion of mine. But rather than give specific sites, it's probably just best to follow me on Twitter for those things at Richard Farley.
At Richard Farley, because you have many accounts, don't you, Richard?
I have one account. What are you talking about?
I don't know.
I have one account, and there is, at Richard Farley, and then, yes. Wait, the sequels, maybe you should decide if you like the original before subscribing to the sequels.
Definitely. It's a niche. Yeah.
Yes, it's a specific.
The other account
subset.
is a different. Yeah, you have to be experienced with Richard to subscribe to the second account.
Well, Kartik knows all about having 2 Twitter accounts, though I imagine that one of them isn't run by him. So,
right, that is correct.
It's down to you to guess which one, though, because they're so similar.
Mutual Kartik impersonator on Twitter. I mean, there's. It seems like every year for the last 4 years, somebody has this brilliant idea and then realizes nobody agrees with them.
What they realize most is nobody can actually speak like Kartik. I think is the ultimate issue.
And how about you, Lawrence? Where can people find your work, and what are some of the exciting things you're working on right now?
You can find me on Twitter at Lozcast, Lozcast, and lozcast.com. With that, pretty much brings all my work together. But the important things to me are the EPL Talk podcast, which is on World Soccer Talk. We work on that as part of a team, and Kartik's part of that. The Gaffer, you're part of that, and Richard every now and again comes on. We've also got Morgan and Kristen and Matt and plenty of other contributors along the way. That's got a great community around it. So obviously, if you're already part of that, come down and listen to some more. And I've just finished one Liverpool documentary. I'm going to start on a second one, kind of independently with Richard Farley. And we are going to be working on it. I work on Ball Street, Copper 90, and those kind of things. So if you're interested in YouTube content and you want to get some more video, then head over to those channels. There's a lot of exciting stuff to come from those guys, especially heading up to the transfer window. So go and take a look.
Brilliant. And Kartik, last but not least, what are you working on these days, and where can people find you?
Well, you can find me at worldsoccertalk.com first and foremost, on the EPL Talk podcast with Richard, on this program with all of you guys, and been working on a book recently, an ebook that should be out fairly soon called Blue with Envy, about Manchester City and recent history of Manchester City and watching. Thank you. Watching Manchester City from the United States. I've left my previous role as the communications director of the North American Soccer League, so I'm now covering that league and other leagues on the outside, and it's nice to be on this side of the desk. And we've got another exciting project we will announce real soon at worldsoccertalk.com, which I'll be involved in.
And Kartik, what about any documentaries you may have done recently?
Oh, yeah, the Tampa Bay Rowdies documentary, which we released 2 weeks ago via worldsoccertalk.com, has been very well received. I've been touched by the praise, the critical praise we've gotten from different quarters. It talks a little bit about the history of the Tampa Bay Rowdies and the legacy of that club, but then also very much about today's Tampa Bay Rowdies, which are a second division club in the North American Soccer League, connecting with the legacy of the club that featured the likes of Rodney Marsh in the 1970s, and were outside of the Miami Dolphins, the most popular professional sports team at that time in the state of Florida.
That's right, absolutely. Well, Chris Harris, myself, you can find me at epltalk.com, which is the main World Soccer Talk account. We'll be keeping you updated on all the latest news, of course. And, of course, don't forget, too, we're going to be back every week with This Week in Soccer with different topics. And depending on what the topics are, we may kind of rotate in some different guests in terms of kind of what the subject matter is. So it's This Week in Soccer. It depends on what's happening in the world of soccer. And we shall be back next week. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon. Cheers.